So I'm Balint Stewart. I'm a program manager with the Dare UK program. Just to give you a sort of overview of what we'll be covering today. So I'm going to give it a little bit of context, a bit of background as to what Dare UK community groups actually are, and just draw to your attention the difference between what we mean by an interest group and a working group, because that's relevant for these calls. And I'll talk a bit about these funding opportunities, what we're looking for, how you can apply, and also our expectations on public involvement and engagement in community groups. And I'll also touch on future funding opportunities under the Dare UK Community Groups Initiative. Phase 2 has recently been announced, and that goes until the end of March 2027. So there will be future funding opportunities for Dare UK community groups. So it may be that you have a nice idea for a community group, but maybe don't have time in this round to apply for funding. So we just thought it'd be helpful for you to be aware of those. And then finally, we'll finish with a Q&A session where we can take your questions. The Dare UK delivery team can try and answer as many of those as we can. And if there are any that we don't have immediate answers to, then we can promise to get back to you as soon as possible. Okay, I hope that's all clear. So just a little bit of sort of background and context as to what Dare UK community groups are. So they're modelled on the Research Data Alliance community groups initiative, which you may be familiar with. So it's really an open invitation for people to submit proposals for community groups that align with the Dare UK vision and objectives. And I'll sort of describe in a little bit more detail the sorts of things that are in scope under that Dare UK vision and objectives. All of our community groups, so interest groups and working groups, have a few things in common. So they are driven by a specific and shared purpose, and that's set out in the community group charter. So all community groups have a charter that sets out the specific objectives of the group and how the group will work together to achieve those objectives. And all outputs should be published openly. Anyone can propose to form a Dare UK community group. There's a code of conduct that sets out the rules and expectations by which Dare UK community group members should abide by. And there's also co-chair leadership, so identifiable, motivated leadership for community coordination. And these are really partnerships, so we're looking for co-chairs from different organisations. So we have different kinds of community groups that serve different functions. So essentially, the two main community groups that the Dare UK programme funds are interest groups and working groups, and this sort of follows the Research Data Alliance model. So interest groups are really focused on broad-based challenges, so they typically play a sort of convening role for the community around a particular challenge area or a particular topic. Running sort of conferences and events, and they may produce sort of community public goods like resource hubs on their website, for example. Working groups, on the other hand, and typically interest groups aren't time limited, but working groups, on the other hand, typically are time limited, and they're formed to produce a specific and well-defined output. So they'll often come out of interest groups. So the interest group might convene the community and sort of surface specific community needs that then working groups can go off and actually produce outputs that address those needs. So just to give you a couple of examples that were supported in the last round of Dare UK community group funding. So a good example of an interest group is PEDRI, so that's the Public Engagement in Data Research Initiative. They're really focused on the broad challenge area of how to do public engagement and involvement in research using sensitive data. So it may be that the PEDRI community decide that what the community really needs is a set of guidelines, for example, for best practice in carrying out PIE, and they may spin off, for example, a working group that goes out and produces that specific output. So working group outputs are typically things like recommendations, code, metadata schema, or an academic publication. Another good example of an interest group that we supported in the last round was the UK Trusted Research Environment Community Management Working Group. which has working group in its title, but is under the Dare UK definition at least an interest group, which is really about how TRE operators and the TRE community can work better cohesively across the UK. And that interest group has indeed spun off working groups that address particular challenges within that sort of broader based problem area. An example to give you an illustration of a working group. So one of the working groups that we supported in the last round was the AI risk evaluation working group. So that formed, for a specific purpose to develop a set of guidelines for the use of AI in a way that protects the privacy of individuals. And they essentially ran a set of workshops, one with researchers, another with data providers, and a final workshop with members of the public to get their views and input, which could then inform their report. And that report was published in spring of this year. So that's a much more sort of well-defined output that working group was working towards. Okay, so hopefully that sort of difference between interest groups and working groups is clear, and it's important because the amount of funding and the time for funding for these different groups is slightly different. So for Dare UK interest groups, there are funds of up to £60,000 available for bootstrapping new interest groups or otherwise maintaining existing interest groups over a 14-month period from February 2025, which is when the funding would begin, until the end of March 2026. And that's for activities principally sort of salaries and overheads for community group management. So that could be some portion of a community manager's time to coordinate and administer the community group's activities. It could also be used for things like workshops, conferences and events. So venue hire, supporting travel costs for attendees to actually come and lunch at these events. And there's also, you could also ask for, support for comms and engagement activities, including things like website development, software licenses, etc. Now, Dare UK working group. So in the Dare UK working group call, there's a bit more money available for reasons that I'll explain in a second. So there's funds of up to £75,000 for working groups over one year period, same start date, but finishing slightly earlier. So the end of Jan 26 would be the finish date. And they can be used for the same sort of activities as described above for interest group, but you can also ask for salaries and overheads for members' time to actually develop and produce the specific working group's output. So that could be, for example, time from a research software engineer to develop some software, or another person's time to sort of put together and write a recommendation report, for example. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about what we're looking for. So we're really looking for community groups, so interest groups and working groups that bring together a diverse and inclusive network of researchers and other relevant stakeholders to achieve their goals. And this is aligned to the Dare UK vision through partnership working. So Dare is really about enhancing sensitive data research infrastructure for research in the public good, to get a sort of better sense of the broad challenge areas the programme is interested in. I'd recommend having a look at the Dare UK Phase 1 recommendations on our website. We can also drop a link to it in the chat. And because sensitive data typically involves TREs or secure environments for research, a major Dare UK focus is on TRE capabilities, both standalone and also in terms of how they can interoperate with one another. So we're particularly interested in some of these topic areas that are listed here, but I should really emphasize that we are not limited in our interest to this set. This is really just to give you a flavor of the sorts of things that the Dare UK programme is interested in solving. So, from enhancing TRE capabilities through semi-automation of TRE operations, data standards, governance models, cost recovery and other funding models for secure sensitive data research infrastructure, and also critically effective public engagement strategies for sensitive data research. So in terms of how to apply, so essentially there are two components here. Now, because the sort of Dare UK Community Groups Initiative operate sort of separate to the funding. So anyone can apply to form a Dare UK community group. They just need to submit a charter. So there's the charter part and there's the funding application form part, and they're two separate things. So for new interest groups and new working groups, you'll need to complete a charter, and as I said, that sort of covers the why, what, how, and who of the group. And in addition to the charter, there's a funding application form. So that really sets out those outcomes or outputs that require funding, and the approach that's going to be taken for achieving those outputs or outcomes. There's a question on team capability to deliver, and you have to submit a project plan and resources and cost justification. I think it's about a 3 or 4 page application form, so it's not, hopefully not too onerous. For existing interest groups, because you already have a charter and you've already been endorsed by the program, you'll only need to submit a funding application form, although we do welcome updates to existing charters. Obviously, if there are major changes to the charter and the scope of the interest group, they will have to be assessed separately. But assuming those sort of tweaks are relatively minor, then only a funding application form will be necessary. And the deadline for submitting both charters and funding application forms will be the close of play on Tuesday, the 19th of November by email. So yeah, both of the charter and the application form will need to be sent by email to these email addresses. Okay, I hope that's clear. So how will your application be assessed? So as I said, there's sort of 2 parts to this. There's the community group charter. So in order for the community group to be endorsed, the group really needs to sort of satisfy 2 main criteria. The first is that the community group aligns with the Dare UK's program's overall vision and objectives. So as I said, a good starting point for that is to look at the phase 1 recommendations, but do email us and if you have any questions about what might be in scope, what might not be, and the delivery team will be able to help you. And that's really, so look at those to understand the broad-based challenge areas that the program's interested in. Dare UK is a UK-wide initiative, so we're really looking at things that are national in scale or UK-wide in scale, but we do caveat that with it may be that your community starts as more of a local initiative, but it's really critical that the work that's being carried out at that sort of more local level has to be clearly scalable and potentially scalable and useful for at least a national level and ideally UK-wide. Dare UK is also a cross or a pan UKRI Research Council investment, so we're really a cross-domain, data domain agnostic program. So we're really looking for communities that are interested in tackling challenges that are interdisciplinary in nature, that don't just have a single data domain focus, like say just focused on health data. Again, with the caveat that the community may arise out of a particular domain, but those whatever challenges that the community group is addressing should also be relevant to those outside of that particular domain. So that's the first sort of major criteria, and the second is that it's not obviously duplicating work being carried out elsewhere. So community groups that whose charter is endorsed, then their funding application forms are reviewed by our independent panel. And I just recommend that you look carefully at the assessor questions in that funding application form and the scoring criteria that the panel will use to assess the application. Again, get in touch if any of that's not clear, but hopefully it should be reasonably self-explanatory what's expected and required of you there. Okay. So expectations on public involvement and engagement. So this is a bit different from the first round of funding. So there's a requirement that there's included in interest group and working group governance and decision making plans for at least 1 public contributor to take part as community group co-chairs. If you remember, it's the co-chairs that are really form the governing body or the leadership of the community group. So there must be plans for at least 1 public contributor to be involved at that level. And in addition to that, proposals for new working groups must also include plans to undertake other kinds of PIE activities. So they could be workshops or focus groups with members of the public to seek public input into the working group's output. So the AI risk evaluation working group was a really nice example of that, where they ran a separate sort of workshop with members of the public for input into their output. Or it may be, if that's not appropriate for your particular working group, it could also involve input of public contributors to review, working groups, descriptions and outputs, and just ensuring that, those remain aligned with public priorities. PIE plans should be embedded into project timelines and also fully costed into your project proposal. There's no upper limit to the proportion that you can use for PIE, although we typically expect around a 10% allocation. But of course, it very much depends on the nature of the work being undertaken. Some of it will be more involve more public engagement, and some of it less. So that's really at your own discretion. And there are some Dare UK PIE guidelines from the summer where you can find out more information on how to meaningfully involve the public in your research. Okay, so just finally, I just wanted to flag that there will be future funding opportunities in Dare UK Phase 2 for community groups. So these are indicative timelines only. So essentially, there's going to be more working group calls opening, potentially as soon as January 2025. And I mention these because, as I said, if you're not quite ready to form a working group, but you have an idea, then there will be future opportunities to apply for funding to do so. And indeed, we may expect some of the interest groups that are, forming in this round to potentially spin off working groups that can then themselves apply for funding in the working group calls that are staggered as shown here. And we're also going to have another interest group call as well that will also enable essentially the working groups that are funded in this round to potentially receive continuation of funds right up until the end of Dare UK Phase 2, which is the end of March 27. So there wouldn't be a break in funding if indeed the interest group wants to get more funding, and indeed there will be another assessment process to make sure that the interest group can keep going. Okay, I will stop there, and I'm very, very happy to take questions. So these slides will be shared with you all after this event, and myself and the rest of the Dare UK team are very happy to take any questions. I don't know if there are any in the chat already. Okay, I can see Pete Barnsley has put the question, will UK TRE working group charters be acceptable for the charter part? Yes, they are. They're very, I think they're very closely aligned, the UK TRE working group charter template and the Dare UK charter template. They will need to be submitted as Dare UK working groups, so they just need to be in the template. But essentially, from my memory of looking at the UK TRE working group charters, they'll be pretty transferable across the two. Is there able to help with compensating public contributors for their time? Trying to do this through academic institutions is typically extremely difficult. So I don't. It's a good question. Michelle, do we have any template for what we've done before? I gather it's the academic groups themselves that are expected to run and administer this, as the funds are being given to them to do.
Yeah, so the normal route would be for that to be as costed in, so kind of as part of the money requested to factor in potential costs to reimburse public contributors. Yeah, I think that's the ideal way. Yeah.
Okay, question from Michael Smith. In relation to not duplicating work, does this relate to Dare UK funded work or work across the wider community? If the latter, is there a steer on broad areas Dare feels are definitely covered? I mean, I suppose it could be worth sort of reaching out to us. I don't think we've sort of outlined particular areas we think are well covered. We've sort of had a rough go at sort of identifying areas that we think aren't necessarily well covered, which is maybe a bit easier. But I just recommend, do reach out to us. I mean, we also don't know what we don't know. So obviously we're very aware of what Dare UK has sort of got covered already. We don't know what we don't know, but we're very happy to sort of see whatever you propose, have a look at whatever you propose for your community group in terms of the community group charter, and give a steer as to whether we think there's that work is being duplicated elsewhere. I hope that helps. Do interrupt me, by the way, if I'm not answering your question satisfactorily or you want to ask a follow-up question. Okay, question from Sharon. Are UK administered community groups with international membership eligible? Absolutely. So you can have international partners in your community group. That's very welcome indeed, with the caveat that international members aren't able to receive funding as part of the partnership, if that makes sense. I'm pretty sure, I could double check this, I'm pretty sure you can support international members' travel, for example, or expenses, but you're not able to actually sort of pay for people's time to run and administer the community group as an international partner. Okay, there's one from Doreen. Can a current interest group apply funding for a working group? Yeah, so if you've got an interest group and you want to, some portion of that interest group wants to, put forward a proposal for a working group, that's very much welcome and encouraged. I would just say, noting that there will be future funding opportunities as well for working groups. So we do expect working groups will typically come out of interest groups, but not always. So the AI risk evaluation was an example of a working group that didn't come out of an existing interest group. Okay, from David, when those contributors receive, so on PPIE, when those contributors receive any benefits, participating can be a risk on its own. Help and policies on how to do this would be extremely useful. Maybe a working group coordinating. Yeah, so we do have some guidelines on that. I don't know, Wesley, do you want to add anything, onto David's point here, in terms of PPIE sort of policies and guidance on how to do this?
I'll just say we've got in the specification documents, we've got a link to the UK guidelines, which have been drafted based on HDR UK PPI guidelines. So if it would guide, I believe, any group managing activities that has to do with involving the public and work with what's in the guidelines there.
Yeah, very helpfully. Doreen's on the call, so she's just said that Pedri are also happy to help with this. So that would be fantastic. So yeah, we do want to make sure, yeah, you're joined up with each other. Did you have a hand up, Michelle? Was it just to?
It was to say the point you just made about Pedri offering support with that. So thanks, Doreen.
Okay, thank you, Wesley, for dropping in the phase 1 recommendations. There are no more questions in the chat. Also happy to take any questions with a hand up, or perhaps I'll just give it another minute or so. We're also, like I say, available by email. So I'll drop both of those email addresses in the chat. We tend to be quite responsive, so if you have any questions about scope or things like that, then more than happy to take those by email if one occurs to you afterwards. The recording will be made available, yeah, Doreen. We'll send out the slides and the recording as soon as we've got them, yeah, sorted. So that will be publicly available. Okay, So if there are no more questions, perhaps we'll wrap it up there. And like I say, Eileen.
Yeah, I put a question in the chat, and it's really about thinking about the current TRE community group. So we've been thinking about some working groups that would hang off them to do with NLP, and I'm wondering if the TRE community group are willing to have that discussion, because obviously it maybe puts a bit of pushes a bit of resource onto them if they have to do it. And I can see Simon's put his hand up, so he might be able to answer that.
Yeah, so I received an email. It's on my to-do list to reply to you. I think.
Perfect.
Unless it was someone else who emailed me.
No, that sounds like you're the person to speak to, and you are interested, hopefully.
Yeah. Basically, I've got some ideas. It's all on my to-do list. I'll get back to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, as much as possible, we want to sort of support join up and yeah, I think it will strengthen applications to show that they are connected in with the broader community. So we welcome all of those things happening. David has a question: will there be events or activities for funded interest groups, working groups to participate and to know each other? Yes, so there will be plenary community groups events. The first one is planned at the beginning of so after essentially a year. So that will be basically at the end of kind of the funded activities for the Dare UK funded community groups. So that will be an opportunity to bring everyone together. But we can also play a sort of bit of a convening role in advance of that to sort of make sure that communities are connected to each other. So we also have plans to launch a sort of Dare UK community groups resource hub that should also sort of enable those connections to be made as well. Okay, if there's nothing else, perhaps we'll leave it at that then. Like I say, do reach out to us by email, and yeah, we look forward to receiving your applications.